I can get that started as well. Um, but while you're doing that, thank you first very much for the opportunity to be here and to speak to you all. It's a really great pleasure to talk to you all and to my dear friends in Norway particularly. It's been a while since I've been there for obvious reasons, so it's nice at least to catch up with you in this way, if not in person, anytime soon. And beyond that, I also see a few of my Australian and international colleagues who've joined as well. So hi to all of you as well, and thanks for coming along. And yeah, let's I think get started if we can get the permissions thing going.
Yes, we are now recording, Axel.
Okay, you're recording it. Okay, no worries. Fantastic. So then I will start my screen sharing. And hopefully you can all see that. And I'll get going. Um, yeah, again, as Albert said, this is very much a talk that's based on this book, Are Filter Bubbles Real, that I published a couple of years ago now, which in itself, as you said, was a bit of a byproduct of another book. Um, and really, I guess the other book I was working on, Gate Watching and News Curation, um, in thinking through this and thinking particularly about the role of news as a form of content on social media. Of course, these issues around echo chambers and filter bubbles very quickly raised their head, and it felt to me that they deserved something more of a discussion beyond what I could do just in a brief passage in that book. So here it is, and that's the outcome of that. Now, let me jump right in and really give you an idea of why we're even talking about these things. Why filter bubbles? Why echo chambers? Why are these topics so much being talked about, so much matters of public concern at this point? Well, here's actually one of the people I cited in the book, Barack Obama, who not only talked about this, but talked about it in his farewell speech, saying that, for many of us, it's become safer to retreat into our own bubbles, whether in neighborhoods, college campuses, places of worship, or especially our social media feeds. So this is essentially how far this idea of the bubble, he doesn't say filter bubble, but that's really what he's talking about, of course, how far this has traveled now that presidents, outgoing presidents, are worried about the idea of filter bubbles and echo chambers and the effects that they have on society. So clearly there's something there to look at, and clearly this is a concern at the highest levels. Now, I want to go back a little bit though, because there is actually quite a long history to these concerns as well. And perhaps certainly in internet studies broadly defined, this by Nicholas Negroponte, this book called, or this idea of the daily me that he talked about was probably one of the first sort of iterations of this, where basically, and at the time actually quite positively, he canvassed this idea that in future, with this wonderful Web 2.0 that was just emerging in the mid 90s, it would be possible for newspaper, as we were still calling them, news front pages, news portals, to be personalized to the interests of a particular user. So it would be possible that when you go to your local news site, you would see the news for you rather than just the generic news. And then he thought that was actually quite a useful thing because it would obviously make the news more useful to news consumers. But this took a much more sinister turn fairly quickly when others, and Cass Sunstein here is perhaps particularly notable for talking about this idea of echo chambers, um, started to say, well, yes, but if that happens, and if other things happen that personalize our web experience and our informational experience perhaps more broadly for us, then we will end up being in echo chambers. We'll end up being just surrounded by the information that interests us, but not others. We will each have our own informational reality. We'll all be surrounded by some sort of informational cocoon, basically, that surrounds us, and possibly then also, of course, not just we as individuals, but we as groups, as ideological groups or other interest groups, might then have different realities, essentially, that we experience in terms of the information that we consume. So Sunstein's actually gone through, as you see there, a number of iterations, and his target has shifted a little bit from the web itself to blogs to modern social media, and everywhere he looks, basically, he sees these echo chambers emerge in these kinds of technologies and networks. A slightly different take is the take by Eli Pariser, who talked not about echo chambers but about filter bubbles. And again, it has to be said, he's kind of revised this, and he started talking about filter bubbles at the start. He talked particularly in the context of search, that different people searching for the same information would see different results. More recently, he's adjusted this somewhat to talk more about social media algorithms creating filter bubbles essentially around individual users and around groups of users. And again, the idea is that this puts us into different informational realities, and that ultimately this leads to, well, in the extreme, the breakdown of society itself, because we no longer have a shared basis of information that we all draw on, but rather we all exist in these different spaces. And what I think and what someone else thinks about what's going on in the world might be entirely different because we're drawing on different information. So these are the concerns. They're fairly serious and obviously fairly extreme concerns to an extent. Of course, they have been maybe to some extent at least seen to be vindicated by some of the polarization, some of the other societal problems, of course, that have emerged in the meantime of hyperpartisanship, of polarization, particularly in the US, where all three of these authors, and in fact Barack Obama, of course, himself, are based as well. So there is a kind of a sense that yes, these things are actually there and they're causing these problems. But I want to problematize. I want to question that quite a bit in this talk. So first, the problem here is that we actually lack good definitions for echo chambers and or filter bubbles. Um, the first question is where exactly, if we want to find them, would we expect to find them? So Pariser talks in the first place about search engines. So that, yeah, when you Google for something, if I Google for it and Harvard Google for it, then we see different results. So we live in different filter bubbles. Okay. Um, that's been more translated also to more specialized search engines like news search engines, news portals, news recommender systems, or news websites as well. And then more recently, of course, with the social mediatization of everything, more and more the discussion has shifted to social media. But again, there too, we need to ask, well, where on social media? Social media are quite a diverse kind of category. Um, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok work very differently from each other. So where exactly on these social media platforms would we expect to find these echo chambers or filter bubbles? Around personal profiles, around the pages or groups that people might visit on Facebook, around hashtags on Twitter, and how do all of these different spaces in these social media intersect with each other? What exactly is the mechanism by which someone might end up in an echo chamber or filter bubble through these affordances? Um, the second question for me is what exactly are we talking about here? And this is to some extent a question of the level of enclosure that these echo chambers or filter bubbles actually produce. Um, in the extreme, and really, of course, looking at the kinds of um, predictions that have been made by the people who've really been pushing these terms the most, in the extreme, we're really talking about people being entirely sealed into these bubbles. So that Republicans have a different reality from Democrats in the US, for instance. Or people who follow InfoWars have a different reality from people who follow the New York Times, whatever the kind of examples you want to use. Um, so, in order for these really significant damaging societal effects to occur, it seems to me that people really need to be locked into these bubbles very, very closely, really enclosed and cut off from the rest of the world. Um, because otherwise, we're actually talking about something possibly quite different. We might just be talking about hyperpartisanship, about in-groups, about ideological groups, or whatever, however they're defined by whatever interest they might be defined, um, who are not entirely disconnected from the world, but just have a shared ideology that may be problematic in some form, but doesn't actually necessarily disconnect them from the rest of society entirely. So what we're talking about there is perhaps something more that's akin to the old idea of the spiral of silence or the spiral of amplification in these groups, so that only the sort of self-reinforcing ideologically orthodox information actually gets shared in these communities and nothing else circulates anymore. So that makes it harder for other information to get through, perhaps, but they're maybe not entirely disconnected. Um, or at the weakest level, of course, maybe we're really just talking about partisanship. We're just talking about in-groups of any kind. So that essentially any party, any activist group, anyone who joins with others around a common cause ends up being, to some extent, in a really weak kind of echo chamber or filter bubble. But that's not really been ever fully defined by the people who are really advocating for these concepts. And in terms of operationalizing these definitions in actual empirical research, that's actually quite important because what you might describe as a filter bubble, I might just describe as an interest group unless we agree on some sort of shared definition of those. The third question is obviously why would any of this occur? And there's really two streams of argument, I guess, and they meet in the middle somewhere at times. One is that this is really a societal problem, a problem of the ideologicalization of society, of greater partisanship, of polarization, of society itself falling apart, basically, not necessarily because of technology, but because people are drifting apart and different parties, different populists perhaps are exploiting that as well. Um, or on the other hand, this is all the fault of technology. It's algorithms constructing these distinct, separate, diverging publics and are keeping us from discovering other views and other ideas because of the recommendation systems and because of the filtering mechanisms essentially that exist. Or of course, and this is possibly more likely, there's some sort of feedback loop between the two. Algorithms detect when I'm already somewhat polarized, and what they recommend then to me reinforces that polarization. That's perhaps a logical thing to think about. But again, there are different camps here from really quite hardcore technological determinists that say it's the technology's fault to people who are very much blaming individuals or groups or possibly populists and others who are exploiting these situations. And then again, finally, there's this question of definition that I'll keep coming back to in this talk. Um, a lot of the early discussion of echo chambers and filter bubbles, unfortunately, has been very much from anecdotes, from the idea, actually a little bit, as we've seen it in the quote from Obama as well, that it's just common sense. Yeah, people are more disconnected from each other. People are more and more in these bubbles. But where's the empirical evidence for it? That's actually a really big question that I'll address through this talk. But part of the problem here is also that essentially these ideas, which should be empirically testable, have been promoted very much by people who are not experts in media, communication, computer science, and other related fields that actually have a stake in this. Sunstein, and I'm not trying to criticize or dismiss these people, but Sunstein's a legal scholar. Pariser calls himself an activist and tech entrepreneur. Neither of them, as far as I know, have much in terms of media and communication scholarship in their background. So that I think is a problem because again there is a need for us to test these concepts empirically, and unless someone actually provides us with a proper definition of what they are and how we might then use that in testing them, there is a problem for us. Just one anecdote on this: Pariser actually, when he introduces the filter bubble, basically says in the book that launched this idea, or in the TED talk really that launched the book that launched the idea. Look, I asked two friends to Google for the same thing. They got different results, so they must be living in different filter bubbles. Um, so that's this kind of argument from anecdote that I'm talking about. And I think that's obviously not good enough. And if that's all that the idea of the filter bubble is based on, then we have a significant problem. So what even are they? What are we actually talking about? There is this really significant definitional uncertainty, partly not just despite, but because of the people who've been pushing this so much. They are also, unfortunately, very vaguely used. They're often used interchangeably, as I've done so far in this talk, I must admit as well, but I'll get to clearer definitions in a minute. Um, and even in the literature, I've seen, as I researched the book, I've seen plenty of articles that basically said, well, we found, or we went out to look for echo chambers, aka filter bubbles. And that's a problem because clearly, they're different metaphors to begin with, but also they're being used interchangeably or differently in different contexts. So unless we've got clear definitions, what do we even do with these terms? They're so fluid in what they seem to mean. If no one can agree on what they actually do mean, then they're just not really particularly useful for scholarly research. But having said this, from my perspective, it seems to me that both ultimately fundamentally rely on uh, a study of the network structures, of networks of communication amongst people and between people and technology as well. So that I think is the in for us. That's the approach for us to actually try and define these terms. So the definitions, the approach that I'm introducing in the book, and you're welcome to disagree with that, obviously, but Um, for me, it makes sense just from the metaphors themselves to begin with, but also in further use, to actually distinguish between two different aspects of these networks of communication. One is connectivity, and that's what I'm attributing particularly to echo chambers. So who connects with whom? In social media terms, who follows whom? Who's friends with whom? So that's about the potential of communication. That's about the social network itself. Um, so are we in closed groups? Are we all hermetically sealed in our own little closed groups, as I've tried to show there with my dodgy little graphic? Um, or are our publics overlapping with each other, and therefore is there some cross fertilization between them? And as far as filter bubbles goes, then what actual communication takes place across those network links or across other links that may not be links of shared followership, shared friendship, shared connection. So how do we communicate with each other? Even if we're connected with each other, does that mean that we're actually communicating with each other, or are there preferred pathways for communication that might exclude some people that notionally we're connected with? So these two are different layers of the network, basically, the actual connections and the communication that happens across those connections. Um, of course, if you add them together, so if you layer them over each other, then they may also counteract each other. So you might be in an echo chamber, but not in a filter bubble, or vice versa. Or of course, they might amplify each other if you're in both with the same people, with the same communicative partners. So that's the kind of logic and the kind of definition that I'm trying to introduce with this. So if I formulate this out, then basically an echo chamber comes into being when there's a group of participants that choose to preferentially connect with each other to the exclusion of outsiders. And the more they do that, the more they're connecting amongst that group and disconnecting from anyone outside of it, the more they're isolated, obviously, from any kind of potential for new views to be introduced into this group. While within that group, content and ideas and views can circulate freely and can keep amplifying them, each other as well. Compare that then to the idea of the filter bubble, which I would define as emerging when a group of participants, independent of that underlying network structure of connection, choose to preferentially communicate with each other to the exclusion of outsiders. And the more consistently they are in doing that and just talking amongst their little in-group and not with anyone outside of it, the more likely it then also is that, of course, their own views and information will circulate amongst the members of that group, and no new information will be introduced into it. So some slight but significant distinctions here that I think will help us trying to work through what evidence there actually is for either of these formations in the real world, in observable reality. And of course, I'm not saying anything at this point about what might cause this. So I'm not saying this is all generated by algorithms, shaped by recommender systems, whatever, nor am I saying this is all the result of personal choice. It might be either or both at this point, and I'm not predetermining that at this point. Okay, so using those definitions, what evidence do we actually have for echo chambers and filter bubbles? Let me start actually, 15, 16 years ago now. One of the first studies that hinted at something going on was this fairly famous study. You've probably seen this graph before by Damage and Glance, who looked at the network of blogs during the 2004 US election. So this is Republican and Democrat blogs. You can work out which is which by the color. Um, and they looked at how they're linking to each other, what the network of interlinkages is basically between them. And what they said was, well, we found polarization. That's quite evident from the network graph. And what they called mild echo chambers. So there's an interesting question there. What makes an echo chamber mild or not mild, of course? But what you're seeing in that graph, at least, and this is why they're calling it mild echo chambers, is that there are connections between those two groups, of course. These orange links that intersect between the two groups. Clearly, there's some cross-linking. There's some awareness of each other's views and arguments. They're linking to each other, even if they're just there to attack and criticize each other. But they're certainly still interconnecting with each other. Be very interesting, of course, to do a similar study now. Of course, people aren't necessarily using blogs anymore, but to translate this to other platforms and see what level or otherwise of interconnection there is between these groups. But I want to really draw your attention to this idea of the mild echo chamber, because again, this goes against this argument that echo chambers just disrupt and divide society, and that essentially it's no longer possible to have an argument across political boundaries or any other kind of ideological or other boundaries, because we're also disconnected into our own echo chambers. Well, this is patently not the case here. There is clearly a lot of cross-linking going on. And you know, does it actually make sense to then speak of even mild echo chambers? There's some mild, I don't know, assortativity perhaps going on, mild homophily certainly going on, but will that actually have any kind of really meaningful effect? Yes, sure, more Republican information will circulate on the Republican side, more Democrat information circulating on the Democrat side, but that's really just what parties are, and that's really just what political campaigning is. So is this, if it's this mild, actually a problem in the first place? Now, let's fast forward 10 years, actually, in this case, to another study that, and I'm just picking these out because they're particularly instructive, and there's some useful visualizations of this as well, but there are plenty more that operate in this sort of space. This is a study from Twitter. And there is a problem, of course, that much of the research in social media tends to favor Twitter simply because data access has been, at least historically, a lot easier. And we know less about these sorts of structures on Facebook than we do on Twitter. We also have the problem that, as this study also does, much of the research is based on hashtag data sets. In this case, actually, they've also then gone to follower networks and gone further out. So that's very commendable. But a lot of the research that we have, and a lot of the research that ultimately points us to supposed evidence for filter bubbles or echo chambers, tends to be very much just based on hashtags. And that's also a problem. But just to take this study then, by Williams et al., what they ended up finding in the end was what they called, well, both open forums, by which they mean interconnection across different groups, and echo chambers. So again, this is kind of curious, because can you actually have both at the same time? But if you look at these network graphs particularly, and maybe let's just look at the right side of this, they actually find for different affordances for Twitter, different patterns. So what they've looked at here, and you may or may not be able to read the small print there on the hashtags, they looked at hashtags like climate change, global warming, and AGW for anthropogenic global warming. And I'm just going to talk about the AGW one on the right there, because then they also looked at the lead participants in those hashtags and how and whether they follow each other, how they retweet each other, and how they mention each other. So the top right-hand side there, you see the follower network, which looks kind of similar to the Adamic glance one. You've got people who accept the scientific consensus on climate science, and people who reject it, and they're very much following their own kind of groups. So from that perspective, there is again maybe a mild echo chamber, if we want to use that language. In terms of who they're retweeting, whose information they then amplify. So this is kind of starting to move from the echo chamber to the filter bubble question. Again, there is clearly some clustering going on, that the climate change deniers are retweeting other climate change deniers. The people who accept the science retweet other people who accept the science. So again, from that perspective, we're seeing some mild filter bubble effects. But then if you look at how they mention each other, they're all over the place. They're talking very much across purposes here, across their interests. So again, if the fundamental thesis of echo chambers and filter bubbles is that they sort us into these different groups, and we're no longer even aware of other people's arguments, we're no longer even engaging with each other, then that thesis certainly is denied by that bottom right-hand graph in this case. People are still very clearly talking at, about, with each other, arguing with each other, dismissing each other, or whatever, but certainly very much aware of each other, and in communication with each other in some form. But they're not necessarily following each other, and they're certainly not retweeting each other either. So from that perspective, well, the conclusion perhaps that there's open forums and echo chambers at the same time, in different layers of affordances on Twitter, might be true, but how can that then have those deleterious effects that Sunstein and Teresa talk about? If people are still very much aware of what each other is saying. So again, this is, I think, homophily. This is preferred connection in a number of cases, much more than it is actually people being sealed off from each other in echo chambers and filter bubbles. Some of this work, by the way, also really looks only at the lead users, not so much at the casual participants, who might also be much more the glue between them. And of course, again, just looking at individual hashtags doesn't tell us much about what other forms of communication might happen outside the hashtag, in follow-on tweets, for instance, or just by people who are not using the hashtag in the first place. So we've got to be quite careful about the use of these studies that look at very specific subsets of the full communication on these platforms, um, using them to claim that there are echo chambers or filter bubbles on these platforms, of course. And this is actually the next point I want to get to. So, what's the counter evidence to all of this? Um, First off, actually, I want to point you to some survey material from the Pew Center on this. So this is from the 2016 U.S. election, which obviously, as you all, I'm sure, remember still, was highly contested and highly polarized between Democrats and Republicans. So this is U.S. data, obviously. Um, uh, and what people said to the Pew researchers at that point was basically, well, I think I encounter quite a mix of belief in my social networks, both Republican and Democrat views. In fact, many of them said, well, I'm really trying to get rid of all of these Republican friends I apparently have, or all these Democrat friends I apparently have. I keep blocking people, but nothing's working. I'm still seeing pro-Trump or anti-Trump messages, whatever it might be. So they were actually by that point, and not surprisingly so, quite exhausted by the amount of cross-attitudinal material that they ended up seeing in their networks, and wanted less of it. So if anything, what they're reporting is basically a failure of Facebook's algorithms or Twitter's algorithms also at that point to filter the news feed to be more ideologically pure. So that should give us, I think, some pause. Um, Again, looking at Facebook, and there's not many Facebook studies, but this one I think is a useful one from the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung from 2017 around the German federal election. What they did here was to look at the people who had liked or followed the page of any one of the major political parties in Germany. And then they looked at what other pages these people also liked, and from that constructed a network. And what they found, and this is what this network visualization is trying to show, is that almost whoever you are, whatever party you prefer in Germany, you still like a lot of fairly generic things. The national football team, obviously, various comedians and actors and musicians and so on. So by and large, there is still a lot of connectivity within that network. There is not just there is a lot of connectivity in the network across political boundaries because people are connected by all sorts of other interests on Facebook as well. And that then also means ultimately that political talk, in the way that it intrudes into non-political spaces, also keeps circulating across that network. And people are very much being confronted by content from other points of view. The only exception to that is the far-right neo-fascist AfD party. And anyone who liked their group basically predominantly liked other pages that were about, were anti-immigrant and far-right sentiment, basically. So they genuinely were far less connected to the mainstream of German society. And yeah, to some extent, then you could call that perhaps an echo chamber. But again, there's still some connection to the rest of the mainstream. Um, Harvard's already mentioned some of the work that we've been doing in Australia as well. So again, another approach to all of this. We mapped some time ago now in 2016 the structure of follower relationships in the Australian Twitter sphere. This is the overall map that's about 3.7 million accounts that we identified and how they follow each other. And then we looked in that network map at the various clusters that emerged and what they were about. And we found there wasn't, I mean, for one thing, there wasn't actually that much politics in there in the first place. There are lots of other interests, obviously. But even amongst the overtly political accounts, there was actually a lot of cross-following as well. There was, some separation, not even separation, but a tendency for progressives, obviously, to follow each other. For people in the hard right, the Australian far right, I guess, to follow each other. But even they were still very closely connected to the overall politics cluster in the network. So again, what we're seeing here is that information, if this is the follower network, can still travel quite freely across these different clusters. And there wasn't really anywhere in the network where a cluster was really trying to separate itself out from the rest of the network, with the possible exception of the teens, who obviously don't really want to be with the rest of us. or the accounts that were pushing porn, which again has reasons that no one actually wants to openly follow them, of course. So other than that, that network is very thoroughly interconnected, and that in itself is again also a sign that there is no evidence, certainly from that perspective, of significant echo chambers or filter bubbles for that matter. We also looked at the actual communication across that network in the Australian Twitter sphere. So if we're getting to all of that, then it might be worth getting back to this question of filter bubbles in search as well. And again, there's been some really interesting recent studies just over the last few years that have come out using a number of different approaches. There's been a couple of studies, one for the US, one for Germany, where basically the researchers either set up fake accounts that were pretending to be conservatives or liberals in the US context, or just got a bunch of their students and whoever to set up accounts and search basically for the same search terms with those accounts to see what came back. The study in the US found that as far as news is concerned, the same 5 or 6 news sources basically dominate the search results. New York Times, CNN, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, CNBC, Business Insider. To the point where the researchers Nehoshtai and Lewis actually suggested that maybe that's a bit too much uniformity. There's not enough diversity in what Google reports. So if there is a filter bubble from that perspective, it's a nationwide filter bubble. All of the US is in that filter bubble, and they're just not seeing enough outside news or not enough diversity from that perspective. But certainly there's no indication that Republicans and Democrats actually get served different news results based on this. Another study in Germany by the NGO Algorithm Watch did something kind of different. They basically created a browser plugin that they invited ordinary users to install that would regularly query Google for the names of German parties and politicians and report back what it got back. And mixed with some demographic information on the users who installed that plugin, they found that basically, again, largely the results that come back are quite identical. In 5 to 10% of their cases, the results even came back in the same order. So there's practically no personalization for these sorts of terms. Now, they're quite limited terms, obviously, just generic terms like Angela Merkel or SPD or whatever. But nonetheless, again, it shows that for these sorts of search terms, there just isn't much personalization that Google does, at least on Google Search and Google News. So again, from the filter bubbles perspective on search, we just don't see any evidence beyond that one anecdote that we got from Parisa early on, that Google and other platforms really provide very diverse results based on who you are, or who Google thinks you are. Okay, so why might that be? Why are we at this point where we just don't seem to have much reliable evidence for the existence of filter bubbles and echo chambers? First is, I think that a lot of the research actually tends to be quite case study based, and as I've said, with Twitter, for instance, very much based on hashtags, sometimes really just quite anecdotal. And the problem here is, I think, that we need to see the bigger picture of these platforms, and in fact, multiple overlapping platforms working together and intersecting with each other. Yes, an individual hashtag, that's the MAGA hashtag or the QAnon hashtag or whatever, might be ideologically pure and might be very much pushing a particular kind of information and a particular kind of view, but they're embedded in a much more complex platform structure, multi-platform structure at that. So the hashtag doesn't exist in isolation. The hashtag isn't hermetically sealed off from the rest of the world. The people who are participating in a hashtag or whatever else it might be, or on a page or in a group on Facebook, also still have all sorts of other connections on that platform and on other platforms through which they might encounter information that represents a very different ideology, a very different views. Serendipity, in fact, is really ubiquitous on these platforms. As we've seen from multiple annual editions of the Digital News Report by the Reuters Institute, for instance, habitual news sharing, people just sharing the links that they come across, is just everywhere. It's just ubiquitous on social media platforms. on Facebook, on Twitter, on other platforms. People are sharing news, sharing information, and I really don't mean news just in a very narrow kind of hard news sense, but really information more broadly. And they do so not just, of course, in spaces that are dedicated to politics or news, but in other everyday non-political contexts as well. And in fact, with the theories around third spaces or third places, um, that kind of sharing in non-political spaces might be even more important, might be even more likely to reach audiences that are not actually ideologically pure, but are quite ideologically diverse. That's the first thing. The second thing is that yes, we might seek out information that agrees with our views or represents our interests. So we might seek out selective exposure, but it's also been shown that that doesn't mean that we're actively avoiding anything that disagrees with us. So selective exposure is not the other side of the coin from selective avoidance. We seek, but we don't evade. So I'm seeking out information that I'm interested in, but if I come across something that I'm not so interested in, I'm not actively blocking that from my network. I'm not actually removing it from my network. The same goes for homophily. Just because we might be homophilous and yes, we're connecting with our friends and our colleagues and our other associates, we're not necessarily actively disconnecting from anyone who's not part of that in-group. Maybe the teens do, but normally that's not the case. So when we talk about, or when others have talked about these mild echo chambers, maybe they're really just communities of interest. Yes, of course, Republican bloggers will link to other Republican bloggers, but that doesn't mean that they're actively disconnecting from anyone else in their network. Certainly didn't seem to mean that in 2004. Probably still doesn't seem to mean it at this point. Going on from there, um, ultimately, again, if you think of the totality of these platforms, it's actually very, very difficult to keep your network pure, ideologically pure in any other way. Um, because, yes, Facebook pages or Facebook groups and other spaces that are designed specifically around an individual interest, we might call them engines of homophily. So yes, I might be going to a Facebook page because it's about a topic that I'm interested in, and because I know I'll find others there who are interested in that topic. Obviously, that's the whole point of the Facebook page. But other parts of Facebook, and the same goes for Twitter as well and other platforms, other parts of Facebook, like profiles, are engines of context collapse. So they counteract each other because in these spaces around our profiles, around other more generic and non-political spaces, we're connecting with people from all walks of life. On my Facebook profile, I'm connecting with my family, my friends, my work colleagues, my students, people who are interested in the same music that I like, or the same sports teams I like, or whatever else. So within that space, we have a really vast and very diverse audience that's entirely different from the audience that might exist around a Facebook page that's specifically to venerate Donald Trump. Um, and people use both, of course, in their everyday experience of Facebook. So they're not simply in this sort of ideologically pure space of the political page or political group, but they're also in all sorts of other spaces where this kind of cross-cutting information continues to circulate. And that's because, and there's a really interesting line in one of Paresa's articles where he says that we basically just connect with our political compadres. And that's why we keep seeing the same content on Facebook. That's why we're in these filter bubbles on Facebook, because Facebook works out that we're Republican or Democrat or whatever. And so it gives us more information for that party than for the other party. But I don't know about you, but when I use Facebook and I connect with people on Facebook or any other social media platform for that matter, I'm not actually checking what party book they've got, what party they belong to, whether they've ever said anything good about Donald Trump. I connect with them because I find them interesting or not. Um, and their political attitudes, I might not even find out until the next election comes and they start spouting weird things about how wonderful it would be if Trump was reelected or others. So this idea that this is all about politics comes from people for whom it is all about politics, but that simply doesn't represent the broader society that we live in. Now, having said all of that, it's possible, yes, of course, to develop a really hard exclusive echo chamber or filter bubble around yourself in these spaces. But it's actually very, very difficult to do that, and so they're very rare. In a sense, you need to be really almost at a cultish level of devotion. You really have to go through your entire follower and friend network to say, well, Republican or Democrat, Trump fan or not, or whatever the politics are that we're interested in. So that requires a lot of work to try and keep that network pure. And if you also have this, peer pressure to connect with your mom on Facebook or your siblings or your co-workers or whatever else it might be, or on other platforms, of course, then that breaks that bubble already. That lets in others who are not as ideologically pure as you are. So it ultimately would be quite a lonely existence, I think, to really try and enforce that in your social media networks. Of course, that's what these fringe networks are for. 4chan, 8chan, Gab, Parler, various others that have come and gone. Um, so that's really what they're for, of course. Yes, they invite a much more ideologically pure community onto their platforms. But that's also why they're so small and often so boring, because there's really not much for them then to do other than to say, yeah, isn't Trump great? Um, so these platforms exist, but even the people who are on those platforms, of course, are probably still on other social media platforms. And in fact, it's been shown that the people who are most hyper partisan, who are most extreme in their political views and most activist in their political views, are also highly connected with mainstream news, even if just to follow the mainstream news so they know what to criticize, what to critique, how to develop new conspiracy theories. So some of the people, I think this Garrett study I'm citing there from 2013 found that some of the people who are most active on, Stormfront and these sorts of neo-Nazi sites in the US were also heavy readers of the New York Times, because they need to know what the New York Times is saying about them, what they're saying generally about politics, so they can then formulate counter arguments to keep their friends, in the cause, basically, keep them committed to the cause, even in spite of all the evidence against them. So it's actually for a hyperpartisan, and particularly also, I'm not talking here much about what we call fake news or misinformation, disinformation, but for people who are pushing conspiracy theories and disinformation, it's actually counterproductive to be in an echo chamber or in a filter bubble, because what they want is for their content to spread, to be disseminated across the networks. So if they're disconnecting themselves from these networks, yes, they can share that disinformation within their own little communities, but it's never going to go viral. It's never actually going to go any further than that. And that's obviously not the end game for these people. So the very existence of disinformation, the very spread of disinformation, actually kind of disproves echo chambers and filter levels in the first place. Okay, so why are we then still talking about this stuff? Um, I mean, the basic point, I guess, that I'm trying to make is, yes, people are complicated. Our networks are diverse. They're not consistent. They're complex. They're made up of all sorts of people from all sorts of walks of life. Politics is just a really small part of what we're all interested in. I think for most of us, some of you, I don't want to speak for, but um, for most ordinary people, politics actually is a second, third, fourth rate concern. Um, and really, they're much more interested in other aspects of life. And so any algorithms that personalize in the first place are probably much more attuned to those other aspects of life than to politics in the first place. That's not really um, the main game for them in the first place. Um, so if you put all of that together, people still have access to mainstream information sources. They're still circulating. There's a lot of random serendipity that's going on, not just in overtly political spaces, but right across social networks. And that ultimately results in quite a mixed information diet for most ordinary users of these social media platforms. The problem then is, and the reason that we're still talking about these concepts, even in spite of that, is that there's such convincing moral panic arguments, basically. Um, Again, Sunstein and Pariser, when they started talking about this, largely talk about anecdotal evidence. Yeah, I had two friends who Googled the same thing and they found different results. There must be a filter level. Um, Now, that's really overestimating, though, how good AI actually is, how good these algorithms actually are. And in fact, since Negroponte, I mean, we still haven't got the Daily Me that he talked about in 1995. So there is actually a limit to how good these algorithms and these automated decision-making systems are that are meant to personalize the information experience, partly because we are complex, and partly because we have multiple diverse interests, and partly because when we engage with those other non-political interests, we often also come across some political content. And that's then very difficult to filter out if you want to do that. So even as early as 2004, David Weinberger talked about the echo chamber in a review of Sunstein's book at the time, actually, as a myth just waiting to concretize into common wisdom. And if you go back to the Obama quote at the start, it's actually done that by now. It's now become this sort of common wisdom that, oh yeah, we're all in echo chambers, we're all in filter bubbles. And I think that's really problematic because it ends up obscuring what's really going on. But it is also very handy for shifting blame, for attacking social media platforms, for making them do more to get people out of these echo chambers and filter bubbles, and failing, of course, because they're not there in the first place. Um, so I'm very much, as you can probably tell, in agreement with this journalist Sebastian Meineck from Germany, who talked about this as the dumbest metaphor on the internet. I think that's just a wonderful line that I encourage everyone to use. Um, the problem is it's not just dumb we could live with, but it's actually keeping us from more important challenges. It's keeping us from the underlying issues that are there, but have nothing to do with these recommendation systems, with these technologies, but actually with much more fundamental societal issues. So people, I think, I'm hoping I've shifted your views a little bit towards this, do actually encounter quite a diverse range of content on social media platforms, in search and elsewhere. The question, though, is what they then do with that, how they process them. And that, I think, is where the current big challenge lies. So just as I'm finishing up, and this is again a wonderful quote from Weinberger, the problem with an extraterrestrial conspiracy mailing list isn't that it's an echo chamber. It's that it thinks there's a conspiracy by extraterrestrials. And that I think we can translate quite easily to where we are now, 17 years later. The problem isn't that there are hyperpartisan echo chambers or filter bubbles. It's that there are hyperpartisan fringe groups that fundamentally reject and actively fight any mainstream societal and democratic consensus. That, to me, I think is the problem. The hyperpartisanship, the polarization, that certainly is there. But that that's there not because there are echo chambers and filter bubbles, but that is simply there as a fact in society, and that I think we need to work against. So the problem is political polarization and other societal polarization, possibly, not communicative fragmentation. There is no echo chamber or filter bubble. The filter, if any, is in our heads. And that to me is the real problem. As people encounter content that they don't agree with, they will immediately dismiss it because it comes from a particular source or because it uses particular evidence. Um, they still encounter it, so they're not in echo chambers or filter bubbles, but what they then do with it, that really is the fundamental challenge that I think we're dealing with. So to finish, how do we then understand this question of polarization? What might we do about this? How can we assess how polarized different groups, societies, whatever units of size we actually want to think about are? Um, a lot of the work has tended to be from the US, and that's problematic because obviously the US is um, already very far down that slide. It's already hyperpolarized, and it's a very bipolar society. It always has been between this, Republicans and Democrats. How does this actually play out in other countries where we have different political systems, different histories of consensus versus argument? So how can we assess these levels of polarization across different countries? How can we assess whether they change and how they change over time? So the dynamics of polarization, um, and how they exist perhaps also across different communicative platforms, because polarization is probably actually plays out quite differently on these different at the individual level. How do individuals slide into this kind of hyperpartisanship, into this kind of polarized stance? How can this be reversed? Can it be reversed in the first place? How do these hyperpartisan groups, when you're in there now, when they're in there, how do they process information that's counter attitudinal, that challenges their worldviews? How do, I'm just going to say, readers of Infowars make sense of whatever latest announcement Joe Biden makes? And how do they attribute this immediately to him being controlled by some sort of secret cabal of lizard people, or just dismiss the information because it's been published by the New York Times and you know who they are? So how does that work? What's the mental process? What's the psychological process that actually takes place there? And ultimately, of course, much of this plays out in the form of misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, trolling, abuse. So what are the processes here, and how can we counteract them? So in fact, that's the other question. How do we actually combat all of this? How can we protect the mainstream of society to the extent that it still exists from sliding off into hyperpartisanship? how can these extremists, once they've become extremists, be de-radicalized? And this may take similar processes as the ones by which you de-radicalize neo-Nazis or religious fundamentalists. Um, how can we counter, obviously, the mis and disinformation? Obviously, there's a lot of work being done on that already. What role can digital media literacy play in all of this as well? That's also a really interesting question, I think, because if you look at hyper-partisan groups, followers of, the various fringe outlets, Infowars and others, um, what they do in order to contextualize what they see in the New York Times or on CNN is kind of exactly the same as what most of us would do if we're seeing information on Infowars. We're saying, well, you know where that's coming from. You can't believe it. They're saying much the same. They just say it because it's the New York Times and there's obviously a liberal newspaper and whatever. So in a sense, they're using the rhetoric of digital media literacy, but exactly in the opposite way from the way that most of us would have been used to using. So this is the weaponization of digital media literacy, essentially to reinforce hyperpartisanship in these groups. So that's, I think, a really significant problem that also needs to be addressed. And obviously, there's a bunch of toolkits out there already for us to do this. I think there's still a lot of mileage in media and communication work that works with opinion leadership, multi-step flow ideas. Obviously, cultural studies work that looks at how people negotiate the readings of their content. Of the content that they see. Media psychology, I think, is an area that we're probably certainly on my side not connecting with enough. Right? Just thinking about the cognition processes that happen as people are engaging with media content. Um, Obviously, digital media studies, and I've shown quite a bit of that kind of work that looks particularly at scale at the dynamics of how information travels and how people connect with each other. Um, and of course, again, digital media literacy education, but also in a way that protects this rhetoric from being abused in exactly the opposite way from the way it was intended. I haven't got computer science on there. That's not really because I don't want to have it on there, but because I think a lot of computer science actually underpins quite a bit of this work when it goes to scale, particularly. Um, but I do, frankly, also, I have seen quite a bit of computer science work that, again, just works from common sense definitions of echo chambers and filter bubbles. And that's not really good if you're trying to prove that they exist with the large scale empirical work that you're doing. So unless we actually define what we're looking for, yes, we can find it or not find it, but it doesn't mean anything unless that definition is being enforced. So that's pretty much the argument of the book. And I'd be very happy to have some questions if we've got a little bit of time left.
Excellent.